Hello everyone, and welcome to Clara Sews Vintage. Today I'm going to be showing you how I made this version of the Sew Over It vintage shirt dress. For this version, I used a lovely brown floral cotton from Moda Fabrics, and I decided to do a long sleeve since I knew I would be wearing this dress in the cooler autumn months. This is actually the second version of this dress that I have made. The first version I made was the purple floral dress that I wore in my seamstress tag video. And I'll tag that video down below in case you're interested in watching it. So let's jump in and get started on making the dress.
So first off, I went through and I marked all of the markings onto my pieces of fabric. So this pattern has tucks in the front and the back instead of darts. So I went through and I marked all of the tucks and any other important markings such as dots or notches that I would be using to put it together. I personally like to use tailor's chalk. I find it to be the easiest, marks nicely on most fabrics, and it dusts off easily. Next, I'm going to pin all of the tucks for this pattern into the bodice and the skirt pieces. I like to sew the tucks or darts into a pattern first because I find it easiest to sew them while the pattern pieces are separate and flat. I do this by poking the pin through one line of the dart and making sure it also goes through the other line of the dart on the other side of the fold of the fabric. Next, I sew in the darts. I make sure to backstitch at the beginning and end of each tuck to make sure it's nicely secured. I then just continue to sew all of the tucks for this pattern in the bodice and skirt pieces. I then went ahead and ironed all of my tucks. The pattern for the vintage shirt dress called to have all of the tucks ironed toward the center of the garment. My next step was serging all of the edges of my flat pieces. So I personally like to use my serger to finish all of the edges of my pieces while they're still flat. You could use like a rayon seam binding to finish all of your seams. Once your garment is constructed, you can go through kind of after each step and finish the seams of the garment. But I personally like to use my serger to finish all of my edges while my pieces are still flat. And I find that to be the most easy and convenient way of finishing my edges. I feel like it makes a big difference in the quality of my work. I think I'm a little bit more careful because I know that they're going to stand up over time a lot better, and it gives everything just a really clean, professional looking finish. So next I went through and I chose the largest size of stitching on my sewing machine, and I sewed 2 lines of stitching at the front bodice shoulders for the gathered detail at the front shoulder. So for a long time I resisted using 2 lines of gathering, but once I started, I'm never going back. I really like to use 2 lines. I find that it gives me a lot more control and it helps me make really even, precise, nice, professional looking gathers on my garments, and I really do think it makes a very big difference in the quality of my work. So I just do I do 5/8 inch for all my seams. So I do my first line of gathering about 3/8 of an inch from the edge of my fabric, and then another one about 3/8 to half an inch away from that. And that line of gathering will get taken out after I finish making sewing the seam that the gathering is in, but it just holds everything into place while I sew. I just take the 2 pieces of thread on the wrong side of the garment and I pinch the fabric with my fingers and pull on the thread, and that gathers up the fabric for me. I then secure it after it's the right length and use my fingers to kind of scoot the fullness along the gather line so that it's nice and evenly distributed, and then use a lot of pins to pin that into place. Next, I just sew along the seam 5/8 of an inch from the edge, and that should land me right between the two lines of gathering. And those two lines of gathering just keep everything nice and stable and steady into place while I sew over the gathers.
Next, while I was at the sewing machine, I went ahead and sewed all of my side seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Next, I took everything out over to my ironing board, and I pressed all of my seams open. I find that pressing seams open, as opposed to one side or the other, helps to reduce bulk and make the finished garment overall more comfortable. The shoulder seams, instead of pressing them open, I press them towards the back or away from the gathers, since pressing the gathers down kind of on themselves would result in more bulk than just pressing them upward. Next, I went and I sewed the side seams on my sleeves. I worked on making the little slit, finishing the little slit part on the sleeve, which I will have a separate video on how I like to sew a cuffed sleeve. But here you can see me just sewing the side seams on the sleeves, and then I used a sleeve roll to press the seams on my sleeves open. Next, I went and I sewed around my collar. So I have two collar pieces right sides together here, and I'm just sewing 5/8 of an inch around the edge, taking my time, going very slowly and carefully around the corner so I get a perfectly shaped curve. You can always go back and restitch little areas if you need to make it a better shape and make it more perfectly round, and then take out any stitches that are kind of jagged or are distorting the shape of the collar. So I think it makes a big difference to get that curve really clean and nice and precise. So I definitely like to take my time and make sure it looks exactly the way I want it to. Next, I went ahead and trimmed away the seam allowance on my collar, leaving about a little more than 1/8 of an inch past the stitch line that I just sewed. I like to do this instead of clipping notches because I think it gives a cleaner, less bulky edge to the collar than if you clip notches in the rounded areas. I find with the notches it can leave a little bit of a jagged edge depending on how close you put your notches, where this just gives a nice, smooth, clean finish without any bulk. Next, I pinned and sewed the back-facing pieces to the front-facing pieces, where they will meet at the shoulder seam of my bodice. When I was making the adjustments to my pattern pieces, I made sure to leave the front-facing pieces about 1 inch or 1.5 inches longer than the bodice. That way, when I sew the skirt facing pieces to the bodice, front bodice facing pieces,
the seam will end up about an inch and a half lower than the waist seam connecting the bodice to the skirt. This will make the front of the bodice at the seam less bulky. Next, I went ahead and pinned the collar to the neckline and then pinned the front facing and neck facing that was now sewn together onto the bodice. Again, I made sure to take my time around the corner to get the shape of it just right. I'm personally really fussy about these little details. I think they make a huge difference on how clean and professional your finished garment looks. And so for me, this is something that I definitely take my time on until I get it exactly the way I want to. And just like the collar, sometimes I'll go back and kind of reshape. If I don't get the shape exactly right the first time, I'll go back and restitch it a little bit, seam ripped, until I get it exactly the way I want it to. I then continued stitching the rest of the facing on around the back of the neckline, over the shoulders, around the back, and back down the other side. Now, just as before, I trimmed very closely to the curved area on the notch of the collar, and then I went through and I just snipped notches on the back of the neck, kind of the curve around the neckline. Then I went ahead and I pressed all of the neckline. You can see I'm pressing the facing toward the bodice with the collar kind of sticking up away from it. And I'm using my tailor's ham to do this around the corners of the neckline. I then pinned my sleeves into place and sewed around the armhole. After I was done stitching in the sleeves, I just went around the armhole opening and serged it with my serger to finish off that seam. Next, it was time to attach the bodice to the skirt. As I pinned it, I made sure to match the side seams, the center back, and each of the tucks that were supposed to line up in the bodice and the skirt. Next, I sewed the skirt facing to the front facing and sewed the skirt facing to the skirt. And ironed it flat before folding it and ironing it back. You can see here how the seams are offset as I described before. So I just folded the facing back onto the skirt and the bodice and ironed it flat. Next, it was just time for buttonholes and a hem, and then the dress was finished.
And there you have it. I really love how this dress turned out. I love the fit. It's extremely comfortable. I definitely see myself getting a lot of wear out of it. And I'm planning on making another short sleeve version in the spring. So if you have any questions about the making of this dress, please leave them in the comments below. And let me know if you've ever made this sew over it vintage shirt dress or if you've made any of the other sew over it patterns. I definitely have my eye on a couple others since I've been so impressed with this pattern. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and make sure you hit the bell so that you're notified every time I upload a new video. And I'll see you next time. Bye!